I'm Mark Dwyer. I'm the Chief of Data Science at Trusaic. Been with the company about a little bit over 6 years, almost 6.5 years now, and really been involved with many clients' pay equity journeys, and happy to share some of our insights and experiences with the group assembled today. And with that, I'd like to introduce Gail Greenfield.
Thanks so much, Mark. Hi, everybody. I'm Gail Greenfield, and I'm EVP of Pay Equity and Total Rewards at Trusaic. I've been with Trusaic for about 9 months now. I spent most of my career, almost 20 years, at Mercer, helping Mercer clients tackle pay equity, and now I'm at Trusaic, helping Trusaic's clients do the same. So I think we can go to the next slide. Okay, great. So during our time today, we'll start by setting the context for our discussion, and we'll introduce you to the concept of a fair pay strategy. Then we'll get into the core of our remediation discussion and talk about where to remediate. We'll talk about selecting a remediation strategy. We'll review budget and allocation considerations, and we'll talk about conducting an employee level review. And of course, we'll also have time to hear from you and answer questions that you have. So I think we can move to the next slide. So before delving into our discussion, I wanted to just talk for a moment about Trusaic. So for those of you who are not familiar with Trusaic, we're a software and services company. And our mission is to create a better working world for all by helping companies achieve pay equity, enhance their diversity and representation, hire economically disadvantaged individuals, and ensure employee access to affordable healthcare. And ultimately, we believe in a world where everyone deserves to thrive in the workplace. Next slide, please. Okay, so in terms of setting the context, this webinar is actually a follow-up to the Pay Equity Deep Dive webinar that Mark and I did back in February. And for those who were not able to attend that webinar, during that webinar, we discussed setting the right foundation for your pay equity review. And this involved a few things. It involved one, reviewing your compensation philosophy to basically understand your organization's compensation strategy and pay programs. We also talked about segmenting your workforce into what we call pay analysis groups, or PAGs. And PAGs group employees into meaningful pools for comparison purposes, and we need to make sure that those PAGs have sufficient statistical power. So we talked a bit about that. We also talked about identifying the relevant, what we call wage influencing factors, or WIFs, to include in your pay models. And we talked about testing your pay models for reliability and robustness. And we also talked a bit about tainted variable analysis and the importance of ensuring that the wage influencing factors, or WIFs, that you're using in your models, ensuring that they're not potentially tainted by bias. And I happen to notice that if you missed our earlier webinar, it's still available on demand on the World at Work website, but only until September 1st. So you have a couple of weeks to check it out if you'd like to do that. So I think we can move to the next slide. Okay. So once you've set the foundation, now you're in a spot where you're ready to develop your fair pay strategy. And in our view, a fair pay strategy involves deciding where to remediate, selecting a remediation strategy, considering your available budget and how best to allocate it, and conducting an employee level review. And today we're going to review each of these in detail. So if we go to the next slide, there we go. So before we get into it, we'd like to just take a quick moment to hear from you. And we just have a quick moment to hear from you in terms of the poll. So the question is, we want to know if your organization has made any remedial pay adjustments based on the results of a pay equity analysis. So your choices are: we have conducted a pay equity analysis and have made remedial pay adjustments. We have conducted a pay and equity analysis but have not made any remedial pay adjustments. We have not conducted a pay equity analysis, or maybe you don't know, you're not sure. I think the poll question is not the right poll question.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Let me fix that real quick.
I'm like, wait a minute. But I'm glad that people are answering. I don't know, Marcos, maybe we pass over the poll question if it's too much
This
trouble.
one, yeah, and I'll get the other one, make sure it's fixed.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you for for helping us understand what kind of data sources that you're using. That sounds like a very interesting topic for a different webinar. Okay, so why don't we move on to the next slide? The next slide, there we go. And maybe move on to just the next one. Thanks so much. So first, we want to talk about where to remediate. So in deciding where to remediate, you'll likely flag these pay analysis groups that we talked about, in which there are statistically significant pay disparities based on gender or race or ethnicity or other protected demographic characteristics. And the statistical significance of a pay disparity is typically measured using what we call a 5% significance level. And this is a commonly used significance threshold. And what it does is it really indicates that there's a 5% chance or less that the result we're seeing is due to chance. And while statistical significance is the gold standard in pay equity reviews, you may also want to consider practical significance as well. So practical significance indicates whether a pay disparity is meaningful from a business perspective and warrants your attention regardless of statistical significance. And in my experience, kind of a consideration of practical significance commonly comes into play in two unique circumstances. So in one circumstance, you have a large group with a small pay disparity. So a small pay disparity, for example, could be less than 0.5%. And it can be statistically significant when looking at a large group. So for example, if you're looking at an entire organization or a division, you may actually find that a very small pay gap or pay disparity is statistically significant. However, in this particular case, you might decide that you're not going to remediate a statistically significant pay disparity that is smaller than a specific threshold. So we've seen some organizations use 1% as a threshold. So if they find a disparity less than 1%, they might decide we are not going to remediate that, even if it's statistically significant. And the second circumstance is when you have a small group with a large disparity. So a large disparity, and just for example, could be, let's say, more than 5% or 5% or greater. It may not be statistically significant when you're looking at a small group. So for example, if you're analyzing a specific job or a specific department, you might find that you have a pay gap, but it is not statistically significant. However, in this case, you might decide that you want to remediate a non-significant pay disparity if it is larger than a particular threshold. And just based on what we've seen, practical significance is really emphasized more in Europe, although we do foresee a move kind of globally toward practical significance. And I'm going to make this very clear, as a complement to and not a replacement for statistical significance. You know, statistical significance was still the gold standard and will remain the gold standard. So we can move on to the next slide. And so in terms of when practical significance may be particularly pertinent, there are kind of a couple of different circumstances when practical significance might be something you want to pay attention to. First, if you're in the situation where you're thinking about going public with your pay equity results, for example, if you are thinking about sharing your pay equity results in your ESG or your sustainability reporting, you might want to think about practical significance. So for example, an organization may have no statistically significant pay disparities in any of its pay analysis groups, but it may have either a statistically significant or practically significant organization-wide disparity. And if you're reporting on that organization-wide disparity and you don't want to report on that until it's below a particular threshold, you might have to engage in efforts to reduce the pay disparity to the point where you're comfortable sharing it publicly. And to do that, you might need to address disparities at the PAG level that are above a certain threshold, even if they're not statistically significant. So for example, you might decide we are going to, in every pay analysis group, we are going to remediate any pay disparity that is 2%, that is at least 2%. right? And even if it's not statistically significant. So that's one area where practical significance could play an important role. Second, for those of you who have to comply with the upcoming EU Pay Transparency Directive that will be going into effect in 20 some odd countries over the next couple of years, under the directive, pay disparities exceeding 5% will trigger that joint pay assessment. So in general, when analyzing employees in the EU, we do advise you to address disparities above 5%, regardless of statistical significance, so you can avoid that joint pay assessment. And I think we can move to the next slide. Thanks so much. Okay, so now that we've kind of helped you decide where to remediate, we need to talk about selecting a remediation strategy. And before we do that, we have to introduce you to a few concepts that we'll be referring to throughout our webinar. First is what we call the class effect. And a class effect is a pay disparity revealed by a pay equity analysis. And you'll often see this reported as, for example, a cents on the dollar figure. For example, you might hear Black women are paid 96 cents for each dollar paid to white men. That would be a class effect. And second, and related to that, is what we call impacted class. And an impacted class is a demographic class with a pay disparity. So in the example above, we would say Black women are in an impacted class. Third is the predicted pay. And the predicted pay is a prediction of pay for each employee based solely on the legitimate compensable wage influencing factors that have been included in a pay model. And what's great about this predicted pay value is that it's neutral to an individual's demographic characteristics. It basically is telling us what would we expect this individual to be paid if their pay was solely determined based on those legitimate compensable wage influencing factors. Fourth is the individual effect. And the individual effect is the portion of an individual's actual pay that we cannot explain by those legitimate compensable wage influencing factors that we've included in our pay model and can't be explained by the individual's demographic characteristics. So we don't necessarily know what's driving this individual effect. All we know is that it's not due to the factors that we've included in our model, and it's not due to an individual's demographic characteristics. And this individual effect can be both positive or negative. And lastly is standard deviation. And standard deviation is really just a way to measure how far an individual's actual pay is from their predicted pay using standardized units. And these standardized units or standard deviation really just facilitates comparison across individuals. So I think we can move to the next slide. So first, we're going to talk about what we call a class effect strategy. So there are numerous ways to address a pay disparity. We're going to be taking you through 3 strategies. And the first one is the class effect strategy. So under this approach, all members of an impacted class are eligible for a uniform pay adjustment to address the class effect revealed by the pay equity analysis. So as an example, if the pay equity analysis reveals that Black women are paid 4% less than white men, then all Black women, regardless of their actual pay level, would receive a 4% pay increase. So essentially, if we find that there's a class effect of 4% for a particular demographic class, everyone in that demographic class would receive a 4% pay increase, regardless of their pay situation. And a primary advantage of this strategy is it's pretty straightforward to implement because everyone in the same demographic class is receiving the same percentage increase. And also under this strategy, pay adjustments tend to be smaller, but they're spread across a larger number of people because everybody who's a part of a demographic class that has where we find some sort of disparity, so they're an impacted class, everybody who's part of an impacted class would be receiving an adjustment, but the adjustments tend to be relatively small. And kind of in our experience, the primary objection to this strategy is that people who are part of an impacted class, some of those individuals are going to be in a situation where their actual pay exceeds their predicted pay. But under this class effect strategy, those individuals, even if their actual pay exceeds their predicted pay, would still be eligible for an adjustment. So under this approach, you may be giving an adjustment to someone who is already highly paid. So I think we can move on to the next slide. So the next slide, here we're talking about what we call the class plus individual broad strategy. So unlike the class effect strategy, where we gave the same adjustment to everybody in an impacted class in terms of percentage terms, under this approach, we're taking a different tactic. So under this approach, in a pay analysis group with a class disparity, every employee whose actual pay is less than predicted is eligible for a pay adjustment, regardless of their demographic class. So we're specifically referring to this class plus individual strategy as a broad strategy. And that is because if a pay analysis group has a disparity, we're going to be giving adjustments to everybody, regardless of their demographic characteristics, as long as their actual pay is less than predicted. So anyone whose actual pay is less than predicted would be eligible for an adjustment. And the size of the adjustment, unlike the class effect strategy, where everybody in a particular demographic class would be getting the same adjustment size, here the adjustment size depends on how far someone's actual pay is from their predicted pay. So larger adjustments would be going to those further away from their prediction. And the primary advantage of this type of approach is that it's a fair process because all employees paid less than prediction, regardless of their demographics, are eligible for an adjustment. But there are some notable drawbacks associated with this particular strategy. So one, not surprisingly, it's less effective at addressing the class-based disparity that you're trying to fix, right? Because you're giving adjustments to some people who are not part of an impacted class. So you're giving adjustments to people based on whether or not their actual pay falls below prediction, but that would then include some individuals who are not part of an impacted class. And so you're kind of fighting against yourself a little bit in terms of trying to actually address the pay disparity. And then two, on top of that, there are some people who are part of an impacted class who will not receive an adjustment. So specifically, those individuals who are part of an impacted class, so they are part of a class that has a pay disparity, but they happen to be paid more than their prediction. So their actual pay exceeds their predicted pay. They will not receive an adjustment. And also, this strategy is pretty costly to implement because you're not only giving adjustments to people who are, to members of an impacted class who are paid less than prediction, you're also giving adjustments to members of non-impacted classes who are paid less than prediction. So it tends to be a pretty costly approach to take. So our third strategy is what we call the class plus individual focused strategy. So the last one was a broad strategy. This one is a more focused version of that broad strategy. So essentially, it's the same as the class plus individual effect broad strategy, with the exception that only members of impacted classes are eligible for that pay adjustment, right? So specifically, only members of impacted classes who are paid less than their prediction are eligible. So here we're not, unlike the broad strategy, where anybody in that pay analysis group who's paid less than prediction would receive an adjustment. Here, we're saying no, only members of an impacted class who are paid less than their prediction are eligible for an adjustment. And the primary kind of advantage of this approach is that it's more efficient than the broad approach, since it limits eligibility to pay adjustments to those who are part of an impacted class. So you're only giving adjustments to people who are part of an impacted class. Also, you tend to have fewer pay adjustments as compared to a class effect strategy. So remember, with the class effect strategy, we're giving the same size adjustment to everybody who's part of an impacted class, regardless of their actual pay. Where here, we're only giving adjustments to people who are paid less than their prediction. So you end up with fewer adjustments compared to that class effect strategy. But the primary drawback of this strategy is that pay adjustments tend to be larger, which may result in higher remediation costs. And the reason for that is because under a class effect strategy, we're just addressing the class effect. So if there's a 2% pay disparity or 3% pay disparity, then everybody in that demographic class will receive a 2 or 3% pay disparity. Whereas if we're looking at a class plus individual focus strategy, we're giving people adjustments based on how far they are from their predicted pay. So some people might be very far from their predicted pay. So you might actually have some pretty large adjustments to make if you decide to bring everybody up to their predicted pay. So what we typically see is that this approach is a bit more expensive. Even though you're giving adjustments to fewer people, you're giving much larger adjustments to those individuals. So I think we can move. Great, thanks. So here we just have kind of an illustrative example to kind of tie it all together. So for each strategy here, we're looking at the remediation costs, the number of pay adjustments, and then the average pay adjustment as a % of salary. And then we also break this down into those that are part of an impacted class and those who are not. So under the class effect strategy in the first row, remediation costs for members of impacted classes are $850,000. And this results in 600 pay adjustments with an average adjustment of 2.8%. And under this strategy, individuals who are not members of an impacted class are not eligible for remediation. So the spend on members of non-impacted classes here is 0. So if we move to the next row, we'll see the class effect broad strategy. So if we look at this strategy, we'll note that fewer members of an impacted class receive an adjustment. And that's because we're only giving adjustments to those whose actual pay falls below their predicted pay, right? So those are the only individuals who would be eligible. So in this case, 400 of the 600 members of impacted classes are paid less than their prediction. So you'd be giving these 400 individuals would receive an average adjustment of 7%. So as I mentioned earlier, you can see that the adjustments, fewer of them, under the looking at impacted classes under the class plus individual broad, there's fewer adjustments, but the average adjustment size is quite a bit higher. It's 7% versus 2.8%. And remember, as part of this broad strategy, we are also giving adjustments to members of non-impacted classes, right? So they're also eligible if their actual pay falls below their predicted pay. And in this case, this results in an additional 1,100 individual adjustments with the cost of $2.9 million. And so under this, class plus individual broad strategy, the total remediation cost is $4.1 million. And note that in this example, roughly 70% of your remediation budget is going towards people who are not part of an impacted class. So they are not part of a class that has some sort of pay disparity. And you can kind of see why this strategy is probably not a common one to select, because you're actually spending quite a bit of money on individuals in a non-impacted class. And then if we look at the last strategy, the class plus individual focus strategy, the cost of remediation for those in impacted classes is the same as in the broad strategy. So we're still spending $1.2 million for 400 adjustments. But in this case, members of non-impacted classes are not eligible for remediation. So like the class effect strategy, this focus strategy just considers impacted classes. And as I mentioned earlier, it's more expensive than the class effect strategy because we're spending resources to move individuals, not just their class effect, but their individual effects. So as I mentioned earlier, we typically see this class plus individual focused strategy is going to be a bit more expensive. Even though you're giving fewer adjustments, you're giving adjustments to people based on how far their actual pay is from prediction. And those numbers tend to be larger than the size of the class effect. So I think we can move on. Okay, so now we have before I hand it over to Mark, we want to do one more poll question. All right. And so for those that have engaged in remediation, which of these most closely matches your strategy? Is it a class effect, class plus individual broad strategy, or class plus individual focus strategy? Or maybe you just have no idea, which is perfectly fine. All right, let's see. We'll give it another few seconds. Okay, I think we're at a good stopping point. Okay, that's perfectly fine if you don't know, if you're not sure. But for those that do know, it does sound like the class plus individual focus strategy is the most common, and that's actually what we see too in the work that we do with our clients. So this aligns with what we see as well. And with that, I will hand it over to Mark.
Thanks, Gail. Just one more comment on that poll result. So the class plus individual broad strategy is about 3 times more popular than the class effect strategy. And Gail may have mentioned this, but the broad strategy can actually be counterproductive. So you're remediating people who are in a high wage demographic but as a group. So the demographic as a whole is the high wage group, but there's some people in that group who are low. And so you're actually bringing up the average for people in the high wage demographic as well. So now the people say, suppose that's the white male group, right? So now the people in the other groups are further away from that. So there's a little bit of a chasing your tail element to that second option, the classless individual effect broad strategy, or there can be. Great. So thanks, Gail. Yes, budget considerations. So Gail laid out the different strategy, a couple of these different strategies, and walked through sort of an example with those. Oftentimes we see employers have limited resources, right? So they're not going to be able to achieve fully implement one of these strategies. And so what we wanted to walk through here is some different options that you have. And different considerations that can come into play when trying to set a budget and then implement remediation. Next slide, please. So we're going to, yes, okay, so option number one. So option number one really is a bit amorphous. We're basically laying out, the basic point here is that there are many considerations that can come into setting a budget for remediation. How big are the pay disparities? Is certainly an issue that goes to that sort of practical significance. What jurisdictions are you in? What's the statistical significance level that you might be held to as a way of prioritizing which ones to consider? Some pay disparities may be larger in terms that the cents on the dollar difference is bigger, but they're not statistically significant. But in certain jurisdictions, maybe like in the U.S., you want to have more of a focus on statistical significance. So that's going to affect your budget as to which priorities you set. Reliability and robustness is pretty important too. Okay, so we talked. I think we're all sort of pretty familiar with the idea of the statistical significance of the class effects. Okay, this black effect, this black disparity, this black or whatever we see as a race or gender difference, is it statistically significant? But in addition to that, we're also getting from the pay equity analysis, we're also getting a prediction of pay, what is the neutral pay point for each individual, right? So that actually has a reliability measure to it as well. Okay, so there's two things that are two issues of reliability. One is the reliability of the class effect that's being measured, and the other is the reliability of the predicted pay component. And that can influence your strategies as well, and also as a consequence, your budgets. Reviewing individual employee results, right? So this has to do, this can have an impact, as we'll see, on what the ultimate budget is that you're going to be allocating, depending upon whether there are certain eligibility requirements that you would want to impose before rolling out a remediation across a broader group. And then other priorities, right? Where resources are always limited, so where pay equity fits into that broader set of priorities. So one starting point under this sort of first strategy is to say what's available. Okay, so we have we measure a pay disparity that's statistically significant and practically significant, and maybe it's $700,000 or $800,000, right? But we don't have that much money to spend. So let's say we have $200,000 to spend. That's a legitimate way of making progress, right? Is to have a budget, to be devoting resources to it. And as Gail laid out, there are different strategies, different ways of thinking about what you want to address. So that's what these next items are going to be looking at. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Great. So the first idea, and this ties very strongly to the class plus individual strategy that Gail described, is to remediate those who are furthest from prediction. Okay, and we could even narrow our focus just to the focus strategy, which is looking at those that are in impacted classes, that is, class effects that are statistically significant and practically significant. So here we have a limited budget, perhaps, but we want to get to a certain threshold. Okay, so we're measuring people relative to the predictions of the model, the predicted pay points for each individual that come from the regression analyses. And the question is, how far are people below prediction? Right, so we'll focus on those impacted classes, those gender, race, age groups, where we find statistical significance differences, and then look at how far each individual is from their predicted pay point. So we might set a threshold that we don't want people to be below a certain level, below their predicted pay, and that's what this 1.5 standard deviations idea is. It could be 2, it could be 1.5, it could be 1.7, but it's just to put some sort of marker out there, some sort of line out there. We say we really don't want, we have some discrepancies with respect to predicted pay, but we don't want them to fall below a certain threshold. Okay, and that is variable, and so you can think about setting that threshold ahead of time and what budget that would imply. So in this example, we're saying that if you want to get to a 1.5 standard deviations, no one was below that, no one was further away from their predicted pay than 1.5 standard deviations, then that might take $300,000. Okay. I would note here that this strategy, because it depends on class plus individual focused, is relying on those pay predictions, right? So again, the reliability, having assessments of the reliability of those pay predictions is important. Okay, next option. Removing statistical significance. Okay, so instead of that second option was to try to put a floor so that no one's further from their predicted pay, further below their predicted pay than a certain threshold. The second option is to get rid of statistical significance. So this would be making adjustments either with a class effect or a classless individual strategy. Usually they both are effective here, to not completely eliminate disparities, class effects. There would still be some class effects remaining, but to get it to the point where these class effects, these disparities, are no longer statistically significant at a given level, say 5%, which is sort of the standard. What we put here is the idea of going to p-values are kind of weird because the bigger the p-value, the less significant the effect is. So we've talked here. We're proposing that it might cost $400,000 to get statistical significance up so that things are not significant at a 10% level. That's a 1 in 10 chance as opposed to a 1 in 20 chance that the results are due to randomness, as Gail described. So in this creates a little bit of a buffer. So you still have disparities, okay, but you're creating a little bit of a buffer so that things are not just below the threshold of 5% statistical significance, but there's a little bit of a buffer there. When you run the data for next quarter, say, to take a look, and you've got some transitions in your workforce, you'd like some sort of buffer after your remediation, excuse me, to create the greater likelihood that you're not going to fall back into statistical significance. So, as this points out, this disparity would still exist, but it would not be statistically significant. Okay, now we get to number 4, the fourth option, which is removing practical significance. Okay, and these numbers that we've made up here, these are all hypotheticals. The ranking of these may not be accurate for particular circumstances, but we suppose instead of in this case just getting rid of statistical significance, maybe we want to get rid of practical significance, and that might mean and we're using here the example of the EU Pay Transparency Directive, which is looking for a 5% effect. So not statistical significance, but a 95 cents on the dollar. Okay, are people below 95 cents to the dollar in terms of pay differences due to gender, race, age, or other demographics? So the cost of doing that, to getting people over that threshold, and here again we're putting a buffer in of say 0.5% to 4.5%, might be $500,000. Okay, so budgets are what these last 3 are saying. So the first example was many considerations come into setting a budget. The second, third, and fourth are showing that particular objectives will set a budget as well. Okay, you can derive a budget from these different objectives. Okay, so let's go to the next slide then. Allocation considerations, great. So we've seen that depending upon what kind of objective you pick, you're going to get a different budget to fully address that issue, and that we've seen that some of these objectives are not complete remediation, which is sort of the cases that Gail was dealing with, right, where we're trying to completely remove a pay disparity to drive those class effects effectively to zero. But here we're trying to either get rid of statistical significance, put a floor under people under option 2, or get rid of practical significance. Okay. Option 1 that we talked about had multiple considerations, and maybe it was just available budget, right? That could be carved out of other priorities. The remaining options each focus on a particular objective. But the key point of this slide is that any budget spent will make progress against all of those objectives typically. Okay, they'll all improve. Maybe not to the extent that you'd like. Okay, you won't get to the same standard deviation level. You may not get the complete removal of statistical significance, but any budget that you spend under the strategies that have been outlined, the class effect strategy or the focused class plus individual strategy, will typically make progress against multiple objectives. So for example, with that $200,000 budget, that's we in the hypothetical that we just talked about, that's not going to get us to the 1.5 standard deviation, so that we have that floor that we were shooting for, but it might get us to 1.7. Okay, it might not reduce statistical significance completely, maybe not to even to the 10% level, maybe not even resolving it at the 5% level for all classes, right? But it might resolve some of them. So we might weaken the statistical significance of the results and find some groups, some demographics, and some pay analysis groups for which we were able to resolve the statistical significance. And in terms of reducing the the practical significance, again, under either of those strategies with $200,000, you're going to make progress on reducing, typically, you're going to make progress on reducing the magnitude of those practical significance and the effects. And so, for example, suppose we're starting with a 9% pay disparity, so 91 cents to the dollar. You might get that down to a 7% pay disparity with that spend. Okay, so it doesn't get it across that 5% threshold we were talking about, but it makes progress in that direction. The same applies to the other budget options. Okay, so even though you might have been targeting getting that floor under option 2 under people so that they weren't so far away, right, with a class plus individual focus strategy, that's going to make progress on reducing statistical significance and reducing practical significance. Okay, so all of these strategies, the two dominant strategies that Gail described have, you can look at, you can set budgets based on objectives, but either of those strategies you can make progress usually on multiple fronts. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so each budget allocation targets a different priority, but all usually make progress. Class effects strategy targets individuals and impacted classes with the largest pay disparities. I talked about reliability. The class effect strategies depends upon the reliability of the class effects, okay, because you're using that to set remediation targets. Class plus individual focus strategy targets members of impacted classes who are most below the predicted pay based on predictions from the regression analysis based on the included wage influencing factors. So here, a key reliability issue is the reliability of those predictions. Other allocations are possible as well. For example, if it's important that all employees are eligible for adjustments under any strategy receive an increase, pay adjustments can be prorated based on the available budget. And that's sort of what we can think of as that first option, right? We can think of that 200,000. It's not achieving any any of the objectives, but either if it was a class effect or class plus individual effect, that's essentially a prorated option. Okay, you're making progress. You're remediating the people that are furthest away under a class plus individual. You're probably focusing on the classes with the largest disparities under a class effect strategy. So you're making progress, and you can also prorate further, for instance, under those strategies by again, reallocating. All right, next slide, please. Great. Okay. Employee level review. So once you've decided on a remediation strategy, budget, and an allocation approach, it's time to put it into action. So depending upon the kind of strategy you've chosen, you'll make sort of different. You may make different types of reviews. Your decisions will result in a list of individuals identified for pay adjustments and a proposed pay adjustment for each individual. Okay. So it's worthwhile to think about what the employee level review is, obviously, before you start making adjustments. Specific individuals on the list and the adjustment amounts will depend upon the strategy, your budget, and the allocation approach. Next slide, please. All right, so employee level review. So suppose you were working with a class effect strategy, okay? All members of an impacted class will receive the same percentage pay adjustment, okay, because it's a percentage effect that the analysis is measuring as the class effect. It's a cents on the dollar deviation that's explained by a demographic and not explained by wage influencing factors. So this is pretty straightforward, right? What's a 2% increase for everybody, okay, in a given demographic, okay. Now, can you do carve outs here? Absolutely. So what it'll weaken the effect. It'll weaken the effectiveness of the remediation, but you can certainly take into account people who were recently promoted. Maybe you don't want to make adjustments to them. People who are recently hired. Maybe you don't want to make adjustments to them because their pay's already been set. It could now, if performance is in the model, you may not consider carving out poor performers because it's already been in the analysis. But you could also exclude poor performers from a class effects adjustment. But if they're in an impacted group, an impacted class, i.e. demographic, highly paid individuals and poor performers should receive an adjustment. Okay, the analysis is looking at the group as a demographic group. Okay, after controlling for all their differences in tenure, in function, and so on. In practice, you may decide to set reasonable eligibility requirements, but under the class effect strategy, you should expect to make most of the adjustments on your list after imposing basic eligibility requirements. And one of the key considerations here is that it's typically not what we've described here are criteria that apply across individuals, right, for exclusions. Okay, so suppose people are already outside their budget range, right? Maybe they're not going to get an adjustment, okay, outside their salary range. Maybe poor performers, again, a performance metric, it's a certain cutoff. So it's not really at the individual level, it's identifying subsets of your workforce that you don't want to make adjustments to. But under this strategy, you would be making, for it to be effective, you'd be making most of the adjustments. Okay, next slide. So a class plus individual strategy, now you're looking at, you've got that pay prediction from the analysis, right? And so now you're looking at, there's an individual component in your remediation for each employee, right? Now there's a distance that's not explained by not just the demographic distance, but now there's an individual component to pay differences. So adjustments are limited to those whose actual pay is less than predicted. Okay, so it's in this we're looking at that predicted pay from the analysis. It's possible that the relevant WIFs are excluded due to lack of data, and you may be using proxies for some WIFs. Okay, so why these are issues about reliability, right? If we know that certain factors weren't measured but they're relevant to pay, that we've excluded them either on purpose because maybe they're measured with noise and we were concerned that it might be biased. We talked about tainted variables in an earlier webinar. So some features might be excluded, but nevertheless, we want to try to take them into account in this individual review qualitatively, okay? So to ensure that these adjustments, the remediation amounts for each individual are appropriate, review employees on the list one by one. And that would often involve HR business partners in this review process. The review process will determine if there's a legitimate reason that explains an employee's lower than predicted pay, performance, or prior experience. So again, this is typically thinking about features that are not in the analysis that weren't already included in the pay equity audit. So if there is no legitimate reason explanation for why someone's paid less than predicted, then make an adjustment. Okay. Otherwise, you should be documenting what that issue is, what that factor is that wasn't in the analysis, but is being used to not make as big or not make a remediation adjustment at all. So in our experience with using this class plus individual strategy, roughly 2/3 of the adjustments would be made. Some adjustment would be made for about 2/3 of the eligible employees under that class plus individual focused strategy that we see used often. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so informing future pay equity reviews. This is really an important feedback mechanism. Okay, so under this class plus individual approach, in particular, where you're identifying non-measured factors that were not in the analysis, okay, that are not a wage influencing factor in the pay equity audit. As those are identified, a real effort should be made to try to incorporate them next time. So if you determine employees without a particular credential or certification, for example, are paid less than their peers, you may want to start tracking this information so that that credentialing can be built into the analysis as a legitimate wage influencing factor. Because this individual review is that's really what it's bringing in, right? It's saying there are additional wage influencing factors. I don't have data on them, but the manager knows, the HR business partner knows, okay, about these issues. There's particular skill sets that we're not measuring accurately, okay? So to the extent possible, those elements should be built into a future pay equity review as a factor in the analysis. Another one is prior experience. This is a great point. It's typical to use age as a proxy for prior experience in a pay equity review, but some evidence suggests that using age as a proxy may work well for men, but less well for women who have separations from the workforce for various reasons early in their career. So if you do find during your review that women are paid less than expected because age is overstating the importance of prior experience, you may want to begin collecting more accurate prior experience information, okay, that gets some sort of controls for actual experience versus just time since college or time since high school graduation. All right, next slide, please. Great. So we have some time for questions.
Sure. And yeah, so I pulled up the questions. So here I think one maybe would be good for you, Mark. So the question is, what is best practice with timing of remediations at the time of the finding or retroactive to X years ago, point of hire, etc.?
So we typically work at the time of finding. So we don't work with trying to work on it in terms of a back pay type of analysis, trying to go back multiple years, but trying to get things corrected at that point in time moving forward. So that's what we usually see, and it seems to be the standard practice is not to consider how long a deviation has been in place, because we really don't have data on that, right? We know that typically a pay equity audit is at a point in time. So we don't know what it was 6 months ago. We don't know or a year ago. So we don't have hard evidence that a disparity was persistent. Now, if a pay equity audit is conducted every year and no remediation amounts is taken on it, that would be a different story, right? But typically what we see is that it's a pay equity audit and then remediation comes shortly after that.
Great. And I guess I would sort of just follow that up with in the case of like an actual lawsuit, there you might find back pay coming into play, but we're focusing more on proactive pay equity analyses.
Yeah, well, I was just about to say, Gail, you're about to put out a blog on proactive versus
Yes.
reactive pay equity audits. So.
Yes, so that could indeed involve, if there's some lawsuit involved, that could involve some back pay. So we have a question here that I think I can take. Is it common to remediate only for individuals and not considering class at all? So I have seen that, and so I'm assuming what you mean by this is remediating people whose actual pay falls below their predicted pay, regardless of any kind of class-based disparity. I've seen that a handful of times. And I guess what I would say is that that is kind of not really a pay equity analysis, right? Because the purpose of a pay equity analysis is to identify if there are any class-based pay disparities based on gender, race, or ethnicity, or any other demographic class. So that is kind of the core of a pay equity analysis. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you wouldn't want to, as a separate exercise, try and create greater consistency in terms of compensation for your, for across your workforce. And so you might decide that we're going to try and bring people who are far away from their predicted pay, regardless of their demographics. We might consider bringing them up higher and closer to their predicted pay. But again, doing just that without any consideration for the class effect is really not a pay equity analysis, because again, the purpose of a pay equity analysis is to identify if there are any class-based disparities, and if there are, to remediate those so that your class-based disparities shrink, right? So you're reducing those. And if you're not taking that into consideration, then you might still have some class-based pay disparities that you just don't know anything about. You want to continue with that, Mark?
Well, yeah, just your last point, Gail, is a great one. So we actually have done work like that for clients where their chief concern was wage compression, that the employees that were hired some years ago are not being kept up to current pay levels with their more recent hires. And we conducted that analysis, but as Gail just mentioned, we also controlled for gender and race effects, because if they're present now, if there are no gender or race issues, and how would you know ahead of time? But if there are no gender or race issues, you don't have to control for them. But if there are none, it doesn't hurt to control for them. Okay, that's the key point. Okay, you're not creating gender or race issues by simply looking to see if there are any. And if there are gender or race issues, then the measure of wage compression is distorted. The measure of the influence of your wage influencing factors is distorted by the fact that you're not taking those into account.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. And there's actually a similar question, which I think we would say the same response. This individual said, we don't look at class in pay equity analysis. We look at the team and every individual's experience. So it sounds like you're trying to do some sort of truing up, based on more of a qualitative review. And again, there's nothing wrong with trying to create pay consistency. But if you're trying to understand pay equity, you really do need to ask yourself, do we see any pay disparities based on gender or race or some other protected demographic characteristic, in order for it to really be a pay equity analysis from, kind of trying to prevent, address and prevent pay disparities based on demographic characteristics. You might be thinking this more as just trying to create pay consistency, right? Which is different, which is valid, but different from a pay equity analysis. Let's see. Oh, this is good for you, Mark. For class plus individual, how do you determine the adjustment that should be made?
So the starting point is that difference between actual pay and the prediction based on wage influencing factors. Okay, the strategies that we use basically look at, as Gail mentioned, we usually use that focus strategy. So we would first limit it to the cases where there's a significant class effect in those demographic groups. And then we would look to see who's furthest away, okay, in standard deviation units, let's say, okay, from their predicted pay, and prioritize those. And we have tools that would basically put a floor in, okay, so and it's rolling. So whatever budget you pick, you can put you can see what that floor is. Is it 2 standard deviations? Is it 1.5 standard deviations? So it prioritizes those who are furthest away, typically, under that strategy.
Great, thanks, Mark. So now we have a question about targeting a standard deviation threshold. Is there a rule of thumb? I don't know about you, Mark, but really there isn't a rule of thumb, right? I mean, we tend to see, I've seen a lot of kind of, 2 standard deviations is somehow meaningful, and it's really not. It really is dependent, in my view, on what your budget is. Like, how much money do you have to spend? So can you, like if you have a certain amount of money, you might say, okay, with this budget, we can bring everybody to the point where they're no further than 1.5 standard deviations. And that was the example that Mark showed earlier. Or you might say, actually, we want to bring everybody within 1 standard deviation. So often I feel like that's based on kind of your budget and how much resources you have available. I don't know, Mark, if you have any additional thoughts.
Well, yeah. So as we've mentioned, there are multiple parts to a pay equity analysis. There are multiple measures of significance, and I think there's a sense of confusion where people think about the standard deviations that employees are below their predicted pay. That's great, but that's not related to the statistical significance in any direct way to the statistical significance of the class effects. Clearly, remediating is going to reduce the statistical significance, okay, of the class effects, but there's no formula tying those things together. So I completely agree with Gail that there are no magic numbers in terms of standard deviations for classless individual remediation.
And then we have a question: how do you communicate out the class effect pay increases without alarming the class? Well, that's a very good question. In our experience, most organizations, regardless of whether using a class effect strategy or whatever strategy they're using, it's typically a best practice to roll in your pay equity adjustments into your merit adjustments. There are a handful of companies that might do separate pay equity adjustments, but they're very rarely communicated as such, right? So typically during the merit process, they're rolled in, and so they're communicated much as you would a merit adjustment. And then if they're off cycle, you might communicate it more as a market adjustment, but it'd be very rare to explicitly say, we're giving you this adjustment because we've identified a class-based disparity and we're rectifying that. I see we're at the top of the hour. I'm happy to answer these last couple of questions for those that want to stay on, because I think they're fairly quick to answer. What are the typical wage influencing factors you would consider? Mark, you want to quickly kind of talk through some of those?
Sure. So yeah, well, it's a big topic, but I would say briefly to think beyond the things like tenure and prior experience. We often use the overall responsibility of the company. Certainly, job level comes in. But what I would want to emphasize is that think about other factors that describe the function of a job if you didn't have the job title. Because most organizations have just a few people in many jobs. They have many different titles. They have too many titles in some sense. So those often aren't measurable within a statistical analysis. So what we have to fall back on are department level, line of business, company, and other elements, job family group. So all of those organizational elements that you might not normally think of as a wage influencing factor, consider including those and bring that data to bear as well.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. And then one last question: what is the suggested cadence for pay equity review? So typically we would recommend doing a pay equity analysis and conducting remediation once a year. So you're actually making pay adjustments. And as I mentioned, usually in conjunction with your merit process. But we do recommend monitoring your pay equity situation throughout the year. So perhaps, every quarter or twice a year, so that you're not surprised during the next, remediation cycle. So you'll have a sense of how things have evolved if you're making improvements. So it's really about tracking your progress over time, but you would likely only actually remediate once per year. And I think that's it. Oh, I'm sorry, Mark, if you wanted
and
to.
just on that ongoing remediation, even if you're ongoing monitoring, you usually need some space to get a budget together, right? So you need some sort of foreknowledge of where you might be when it comes time to make adjustments. So that ongoing monitoring assists with that.
Thanks so much, Mark.